They laughed when she left her village, their voices carrying across the dusty square like a death sentence. They said she would come back with nothing, a girl who had reached too high and would eventually crawl back in shame. But tonight, the dust was kicked up not by a lonely girl's sandals, but by the tires of heavy black SUVs that roared into the center of the community. Amarai stepped out, her boots hitting the ground with a rhythmic, authoritative click. She wasn't wearing the simple green dress of a dreamer anymore, she wore the crisp, dark uniform of the law. In her hand, the steel of her handcuffs caught the moonlight, glinting with a cold promise of justice. The very people who had mocked her, those who had whispered that she was useless and those who had secretly conspired with Temori's urban syndicate to exploit her, were now on their knees. The silence that fell over the village was heavy, broken only by the sound of their labored breathing as they looked up into the eyes of the woman they thought they had destroyed. Amarais didn't need to raise her voice. The power reversal was absolute. As she stood before the elders and the doubters, the blue and red lights of the sirens painted the thatched huts in a haunting glow, turning her childhood home into a crime scene. She looked at the man who had first suggested her family sell their land, his face pale with a terror he could no longer hide. She wasn't the victim they had prayed for, she was the reckoning they never saw coming. Her journey from the village hadn't just changed her life, it had given her the power to end their reign of shadows forever. The morning of the departure, the air in the village was thick with more than just the usual rising dust, it was heavy with the suffocating weight of 1,000 unvoiced doubts. Amarai's home had always been a sanctuary of warmth, but today, that love felt crowded out by the small-minded whispers of those who gathered at the periphery. In the communal square, the elders spoke in low, jagged tones, debating the wisdom of sending a girl so far across the ocean. To them, she wasn't a pioneer, she was a gamble they expected to lose. Inside her small home, the reality was far more visceral. She watched her father's hands tremble slightly, hands that were now empty of the deed to the family land. Her mother moved in a silent, heartbreaking rhythm, her neck bare of the gold heirloom she had sold to finalize the visa. They weren't wealthy, yet they had dismantled their past to build her a bridge to the future. When the time came to leave, the walk to the village gate felt like an eternity. Every step Amarais took in her simple green dress was followed by the cold, judging eyes of neighbors who stood with crossed arms, waiting for her to falter. The tears began to stream down her cheeks as she gripped the handle of her warm brown suitcase, the only thing she truly owned. At the gate, her mother's final embrace felt like an anchor she was forced to cut loose. Hours later, the roar of the airplane engines replaced the quiet sounds of the forest. High above the clouds, tucked into a cramped window seat, Amarais watched the world she knew vanish into a patchwork of green and brown. Her reflection in the glass showed a girl no longer crying, but transformed by a sudden, sharp resolve. As the lights of the cabin dimmed, she leaned closer to the pane and whispered a single, silent vow into the dark, a promise the world wasn't yet ready to hear. The moment Amarai stepped out of the terminal, the cold hit her like a physical blow, a sharp, metallic chill that smelled of jet fuel and rain. This new world was nothing like the glossy pictures in the university brochures. It was louder, faster, and profoundly indifferent to the fact that she had just uprooted her entire soul to be here. Everything felt like a mountain, the labyrinth of the airport, the confusing housing forms, and the registration lines where people spoke in clipped tones that made her feel smaller with every passing second. Disorientation began to settle in her chest, a heavy panic that she was drowning in a sea of strangers who didn't care if she sank. That was when she heard it, the sweet, familiar lilt of her own language cutting through the stereo noise of the crowd. She turned to find Temari standing there, looking like a vision of everything Amarais hoped to become. Temari didn't look like a threat, she looked like a lifeline. She moved with a polished ease, her smile warm and maternal as she stepped forward to steady Amarais's shaking hand. To Amarais, this encounter felt like an answered prayer, a sign that the universe hadn't abandoned her in this grey, concrete wilderness. Temari spoke of sisterhood and shared struggles, offering a ride and a place to rest that bypassed all the confusing bureaucracy. Amarais, starving for a sense of belonging and exhausted by the weight of her own suitcase, didn't see the way Temori's eyes scanned her for vulnerabilities. She saw only a friend in a land of enemies, unaware that the first door to open for her was also the one that led into the deepest shadow. Gemini said. Temori's world was a dazzling kaleidoscope of everything the village had whispered was impossible. Within days, Amarais was no longer navigating the cold city alone, she was being ushered into a sisterhood that felt like a warm embrace. Temori introduced her to a circle of young women who looked like her and spoke her language, yet moved with an urban elegance that radiated success. They dined in rooms filled with the scent of expensive spices, surrounded by designer labels and laughter that drowned out the echoes of the doubters back home. For the first time, Amarais felt the heavy burden of her green dress and brown suitcase begin to lift. This life felt effortless. There were no grueling chores, no judgment from elders, just a sense of belonging she had craved since the moment she left the village gate. She couldn't identify a price for any of it, because so far, nothing had been asked of her. She was simply a guest in a paradise of gold and silk. But as the girls toasted to their bright futures, Temori sat slightly back in the shadows, her eyes never leaving Amarais. Her gaze wasn't one of friendship, but of a merchant appraising a rare commodity. She was calculating, patient, and precise, measuring exactly how much luxury she needed to provide before she could begin to take. Stay tuned, because the true cost of this sisterhood is about to be revealed, and it's a price Amarais never expected to pay. If you are enjoying this story, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Twist of Fera TV. We would love to know where you are watching from, so please indicate your country in the comment section below. The golden haze of the sisterhood began to thin the day Temori called in her first favor. It seemed almost trivial, a small request whispered between sips of expensive tea in a quiet corner of the lounge. Temori needed Amarais to simply be present at a late-night meeting and take delivery of a small, sealed package. You have the most innocent face, Amarais, Temori said with a casual shrug. They won't look twice at you. It's just a small errand for the family. Amarais felt a sudden, sharp prickle of unease. The request sat just on the wrong side of the line she had drawn for herself back in the village. She hesitated, her fingers twisting the fabric of her dress, but Temori's warmth vanished, replaced by a cool, piercing look. She reframed the task as a test of loyalty, reminding Amarais of the dinners, the clothes, and the protection she had been gifted. This is what family does for family, Temori murmured, her voice like velvet wrapped around steel. Feeling the crushing weight of her own gratitude, Amarais crossed the line. She sat in the back of a tinted car, held the cold package, and stayed silent while men with hard eyes exchanged brief, jagged words. When the night finally ended and she was alone in her room, the silence felt deafening. A cold certainty settled in her gut, a realization that she had just traded a piece of her soul for a safety that was starting to feel like a cage. She pushed the feeling down, burying it deep beneath the fear of being cast out. She had no money, no other friends, and nowhere else to go. She was trapped in a debt she hadn't realized she was signing for. The weight of the secret package still felt heavy in Amarais's memory, a stain she couldn't wash away, until she stepped into the quiet sanctuary of the university's legal clinic. It was there she met Professor Holloway, a woman with eyes like flint who didn't offer the easy, oily praise of Temori's circle. Holloway looked at Amarais, not as a village girl to be pitied or a body to be groomed, but as a mind to be sharpened. This path is long, the professor said, sliding a mountain of case law across the desk. It is exhausting and often thankless. But it belongs to you. No one can take an education back. For the first time since leaving home, Amarais felt like a candidate for a future, rather than a charity case for a predator. But as she began to study the mechanics of justice, her eyes opened to the mechanics of Temori's injustice. She started noticing the girls who used to sit at the lavish dinners but had suddenly gone home or moved to other cities, leaving behind only hushed rumors and empty chairs. She saw the pattern, the recruitment, the small favors, the death, and finally, the disappearance. With a jolt of pure horror, Amarise recognized herself in every one of them. She was the next project, the next disposable pawn in Temori's cold-blooded game. That night, back in the apartment she no longer considered a home, Amarise sat in the dark, watching the red and blue lights of the city pulse against the wall. She thought of her father's land and her mother's gold. She thought of the villagers who expected her to fail. A quiet, iron resolve settled over her heart. She wouldn't run, and she wouldn't fold. She closed her eyes and made a silent vow. She was not going to be another name on Temori's list. She was going to be the one who ended the list forever. The transformation of Temori from a savior to a predator was completed in a single, chilling afternoon. When she realized Amarise was no longer answering her calls or attending the lavish dinners, the mask of sisterhood didn't just slip, it shattered. Amarise returned to her room to find her belongings tossed aside and Temori standing in the center of the wreckage, holding a folder of manufactured evidence. Her name had been forged on documents for illegal transactions, and photos had been doctored to place her at the center of a crime she hadn't committed. The warmth that had once felt like an answered prayer was now a cold, biting threat. You think you can just walk away? Temori's voice was a jagged blade. In this country, you are nothing but a village girl with a suitcase full of dreams and a paper trail that says you're a criminal. No one will believe you. No one is coming to save you. Temori expected her to fold, to weep, and to surrender to the same fate as the girls who had vanished before her. She counted on Amarise's isolation, believing that a girl from a dusty village would be too terrified of the bright city lights to fight back. This was the darkest scene of Amarise's journey. She stood in the ruins of her life, the weight of her parents' sacrifices pressing down on her chest like a physical stone. She had never been more alone, thousands of miles from the only people who loved her. Yet, in that hollow silence, she didn't break. Instead, she felt a cold, crystalline certainty settle into her bones. Temori saw a victim, but Amarise finally saw the enemy. She wasn't just a village girl anymore, she was a witness who had been paying very close attention. Temori's mistake was believing that Amarise's silence was a sign of submission. She didn't realize that for a girl who had spent her life being dismissed, silence was a superpower, a quiet vantage point from which to observe. Every whispered transaction, every late-night delivery, and every manufactured lie had been meticulously documented. With the same care her mother used to count the family's meager savings, Amarise had gathered her own currency, the truth. She had recorded dates, transcribed conversations, and kept a secret log of the very meetings Temori thought she was too naive to understand. When Amarise walked back into Professor Holloway's office, she didn't come to beg for a way out or to cry over her broken dreams. She came to present. She laid out the evidence with a cold, methodical precision that took the professor by surprise. There was no shaking in her voice as she explained the mechanics of the syndicate that had turned a university city into a hunting ground. Holloway, seeing the fire of a true legal mind beneath the village girl's exterior, became the bridge Amarise needed. She moved with the authority of the institution, carrying Amarise's records directly to the officials who had been looking for a crack in Temori's armor for years. The unraveling began that very night. Temori's empire, built on the assumption that her victims were too weak to speak, started to crumble from the inside out. The girl they had most underestimated was no longer a witness, she was a weapon. Amarise watched from the shadows as the first of the legal inquiries were launched, her heart steady and her mind clear. She had survived the trap by learning its design, and now, she was the one holding the keys to the cell. The sirens were a rhythmic, pulsing scream that shattered the silence of the dark urban night, painting the glass buildings in flashes of violent red and deep, cold blue. For years, Temori had operated in the velvet shadows of the city, believing herself invisible, but tonight, the light had finally found her. One by one, the shadowy figures of the syndicate were led out into the open, their faces pale and stripped of the arrogance that had once terrified Amarise. When Temori was brought out, her eyes scanned the perimeter for a weakness, only to stop dead when they landed on Amarise. This was the moment the thumbnail earned its true meaning. Amarise was no longer the girl in the simple green dress. She stood in her own position of authority, her posture straight and her expression unreadable. She didn't shout, and she didn't gloat. She watched with the absolute, terrifying calm of someone who had known this reckoning was inevitable from the moment she first began to document the truth. The steel of the handcuffs glinted as the operation was dismantled, a visual symphony of justice for every girl who had ever been discarded. When the chaos finally dimmed and the last of the police cars pulled away, Amarise walked to a quiet corner of the park, the city lights shimmering in the distance. Her hands were steady as she dialed the number she had memorized by heart. When her mother's voice crackled through the line, breathless with worry, Amarise closed her eyes and felt the cool night air fill her lungs. She didn't explain the raids, the danger, or the victory, not yet. She simply smiled into the dark and said, "Mama. I'm okay. I'm more than okay." The dusty road leading back into the village looked exactly as it had the day she left, but as the tires of the dark SUV slowed to a crawl, it was clear that nothing else was the same. Amarise sat in the back, watching the familiar landscape unfold, the same thatched huts, the same ancient trees, the same golden sunlight filtering through the haze. But as she stepped out, her boots hitting the earth with a firm, steady thud, the air seemed to shift. She was in uniform now, the sharp lines of her attire stark contrast to the simple green dress she had worn in her tears. The villagers who had gathered to watch, the same ones who had openly predicted her ruin, now stood in a fractured silence. They didn't know where to look, some stared at the ground, while others peered through windows, their mocking whispers replaced by a heavy, stunned awe. Amarise didn't look for their approval. She looked for her mother, whose embrace was as fierce and desperate as the day they parted, and her father, who held her as if he were finally holding the future he had sacrificed his land to buy. She hadn't returned to be a trophy or a celebrity. She had come back because her village still needed what she now possessed, the iron will, the refined tools, and the legitimate authority to protect the vulnerable from the shadows she had barely escaped. As she stood by the gate where she had once wept into her brown suitcase, the final image was a perfect mirror of her past, yet entirely new. She was the same girl in the same village, but this time, there were no tears streaming down her face. There was only the quiet, unshakable gaze of a woman who always knew she would return, even when no one else believed she would. Author's note: this story is for every girl who left somewhere small to become something the world wasn't ready for. You didn't prove them wrong, you proved yourself right, and that was always the only thing that mattered. Thank you for watching Amarise's journey on Twist of Fate TV. Would you like me to help you brainstorm a new story title or a different what-if ending for this series? The dusty road leading back into the village looked exactly as it had the day she left, but as the tires of the dark SUV slowed to a crawl, it was clear that nothing else was the same. Amarise sat in the back, watching the familiar landscape unfold, the same thatched huts, the same ancient trees, the same golden sunlight filtering through the haze. But as she stepped out, her boots hitting the earth with a firm, steady thud, the air seemed to shift. She was in uniform now, the sharp lines of her attire stark contrast to the simple green dress she had worn in her tears. The villagers who had gathered to watch, the same ones who had openly predicted her ruin, now stood in a fractured silence. They didn't know where to look, some stared at the ground, while others peered through windows, their mocking whispers replaced by a heavy, stunned awe. Amarise didn't look for their approval. She looked for her mother, whose embrace was as fierce and desperate as the day they parted, and her father, who held her as if he were finally holding the future he had sacrificed his land to buy. She hadn't returned to be a trophy or a celebrity. She had come back because her village still needed what she now possessed, the iron will, the refined tools, and the legitimate authority to protect the vulnerable from the shadows she had barely escaped. As she stood by the gate where she had once wept into her brown suitcase, the final image was a perfect mirror of her past, yet entirely new. She was the same girl in the same village, but this time, there were no tears streaming down her face. There was only the quiet, unshakable gaze of a woman who always knew she would return, even when no one else believed she would. Author's note: this story is for every girl who left somewhere small to become something the world wasn't ready for. You didn't prove them wrong. You proved yourself right, and that was always the only one that mattered. We want to say a massive thank you to you for staying with us until the very end of Amarize's journey. Your support and your time mean the world to us here at Twist of Fate TV. If this story touched you, please let us know in the comments. We read every single one.